Hello and a very warm welcome to this episode of the Ideas Factory. I am Naghma. Joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, some of the big questions that we would be looking at is number one, Ukraine, of course, because even after all those diplomatic efforts and the talks, Ukraine continues to be a hotspot. Ukraine border is seeing a buildup of troops. NATO is sending in troops. The Russian troops are already there, and looks like Russia is on the verge of invading Ukraine. Now, the question is that a possibility? And if it does happen, what are the implications for Russia, for the rest of the world? So that's something that we would be analyzing and looking at. Other than that, the Taliban, after recapturing power in Kabul for the first time, are in a meeting, in a conversation outside of Afghanistan in Europe. Amidst protest, of course, there are people who are calling these talks. In a way, it's kind of going to legitimize the Taliban, and these talks should not have taken place. But then, what's the way out? That's what we are going to look at. And India and the Southeast Asia, of course, is also one of the questions that we will be looking at, and Pakistan's new national security policy. So, a very warm welcome to you, Harsh, and let's start by looking at what's happening in Ukraine. Now, Boris Johnson has said that Russia risks a new Chechnya if it invades Ukraine. The British and the US have already started withdrawing some of its embassy staff. Over the weekend, we've seen that there has been lethal aid actually coming into Ukraine, and Russian troops are already there. About 90 tons of US lethal aid is there, which includes ammunition. So, all this has created a very tense situation there, and looks like Russia is on the verge of invading Ukraine. Russia looks at it as NATO's expansionism, but US has made it very clear that here the question is not about NATO's expansionism, but about Russia's aggression. Now, is there a possibility that Russia can actually invade Ukraine? And if it does so, it will also weigh in its pros and cons. And what are the implications if this happens?
Hi, Naghma. I think the implications are huge because it impacts Russia, Europe, the US, NATO, and I think the entire global order. It implicates all of them in multiple ways, and I think whatever we are hearing. Every minute there is a buildup of tension. There is some story or the other coming out about what the plans of Russians are. Of course, Russians are not revealing anything as of yet, but what the Western sources keep on commenting. We have had this idea from London that this is going to be a regime change, a kind of a regime change in Kiev, with a pro-Russian with pro-Russian forces being given the leadership there by Russia. They will be anointed. We are having. There are suggestions that there's going to be a lightning strike on Kiev by the Russian forces, and of course, amidst all this. Ukrainians are suffering. And I think what is interesting is that the conversations are happening, the discussions are happening almost as if Ukraine is not a sovereign country. Everything is being talked about in world capitals, quite eerily reminiscent of the Cold War days. So I think the geopolitical aspect of this cannot be ignored. But I think for Russia, of course, the issue would be that to what extent they want to invade Ukraine, because it will be a costly invasion. It's not going to be a simple invasion where they go and they change the government and they come out with support intact. Their forces will be there for a long time, and I'm not so sure that that's something that gives Mr. Putin any advantage. I think. For Western countries, for NATO, of course, this is going to be one of the most dramatic challenges that they've seen since the end of the Cold War, and I think that is why there is also this sense of what to do about it. Here is we are back in the tradition of great power politics, where West is seemingly disjointed. And if I can comment and bring in the element of what the interesting episode of what happened with the Germans, where the German Navy chief was in India commenting on this issue, where he basically poo-pooed the suggestion that Russians are going to invade Ukraine, and that, of course, he went back and he had to resign. So I think there is a sense that Europe and is very uncomfortable with the way this is being, this is panning out, and of despite several meetings and despite the Western nations trying to put up a united front, I think one of the leverages that Mr. Putin has is that there are certainly tensions within the Western alliance on what to do about it. We saw that when Mr. Biden commented on it, when he said that, look, if it's a minor incursion, then the response might be different. Of course, it was later changed by the White House. But I think there are tensions within the Western alliance as to what exactly the nature of the response would be if Mr. Putin does not really go in for an all-out invasion, and it's very likely that he would not, given the costs of an all-out invasion that would be very high for him and for Moscow in general.
So, do you think, I mean, even though US and Europe have declared unity against Russia, of course, you pointed out that there is an internal, they're not so united internally, and there is always a confusion there. But do you think US and Europe are overreacting? NATO sending in troops, US sending in more troops there, the buildup, the ammunition coming in, and also, a lot of our viewers have sent in questions related to Ukraine. So Janya Mukherjee is asking that what does Putin really want? Why now? What is the significance of mobilizing these troops now, and what implications will the Russia Ukraine conflict have on India's foreign policy choices? Also, if I may add, Shivam has also, not Shivam, but Rishabh Sharma is adding to the same question and asking if, now is this the time? Will it be okay to play non-aligned, or will India opt to go with either side? If there are these two sides two camps that we are now witnessing.
Well, Ukraine. Of course, the first part of this question is about why now and what Mr. Putin wants to do. I think largely you see that in terms of his own ability to, in willingness to shape the European security architecture. I think that is at the heart of this dispute. And certainly what he sees is the West that is embroiled in domestic issues, that is, as you were discussing earlier, a bit disunited. And American leadership, I think, is being tested here. And we know what is happening within America, a lot of polarization, and also Mr. Biden's poll ratings are terrible. So I think definitely for him, there is a window of opportunity here, that he wants to test the resolve of the West insofar as how far the West is going to go in defending some of the for the West. This is about Ukraine's sovereignty and Ukraine's ability to decide for itself. So I think for Mr. Putin, this is a way of testing that resolve. This is a way of clearly drawing out certain lines and also making it clear that, look, if the West can reach out to Russia, then there is a modus vivendi that can be reached between Russia and the West. Otherwise, this is going to be a long haul. So I think he has therefore very smartly used this period of amassing troops around Ukraine and making it very clear to the West that there are certain red lines. For example, if you look at his demands, which are quite categorically stated. Now, if you compare them to Western demands, you still don't find them clearly enunciated. Mr. Biden's press conference, if anything, was a disaster in comparison, because he was sending multiple messages. So I think as far as Mr. Putin is concerned, this is a time to strike, because he feels that he has the leverage, he has the cards, and he can make the West relent on one of the most fundamental, I think, challenges for Russia, which is the eastward expansion of the NATO. And Mr. Putin himself has often said that the breaking up of Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of his lifetime, and that is something that has to be undone. So, in a sense, this is about undoing the breakup of Soviet Union and making it very clear that there is a Russian sphere of influence that the West will have to respect. So I think that is what is happening, and we know that this is not something that is out of the blue. From 2014, step by step, this has happened. Crimea has happened. Then you have the Donbass area, where eastern Ukraine, where pro-Russian forces now control that region, and Ukraine internally is divided. So I think we are looking at a weakening of Ukraine step by step over a period of time, and the inability of the West to stand up, if at all, in crisis after crisis. And this is something that I think Mr. Putin has learned well. Now, whether India's position on this responds to its old non-aligned framework, I think is a question that is going to be much, in many ways, very interesting to look at. Because if you would recall, in 2014, India did, make a case for Russia. That India did not really, side with the West on the question of Crimea. And I think there are there was a lot of criticism at that point in time. But I think if you look at Indo-Russian relationship, if you look at the stakes that India has in that relationship, it's very unlikely that India would give up that relationship for the sake of basically geopolitical, geostrategic jostling in Europe at the moment. I think where India will have to think hard and very carefully is whether this is a tactic that can also be employed by the Chinese, whether this is something vis-a-vis India, whether this is something that the Chinese are also learning, and this can come back to haunt India, whether this is also an issue of a sovereign country's ability to decide for itself where it wants to go. If we go back to the traditional argument of spheres of influence, then I think it creates its own set of negative implications, not only for India, but I think for a lot of the other emerging global powers that I think have benefited in a world where there are no spheres of influence. But I think if you go back to the 19th century model of global governance, then there are going to be costs for a country like India. And whether India is willing to bear those costs, we'll have to see. But I think it's going to be a difficult call.
Right, it's going to be a difficult call for India, and we've seen that all those diplomatic wranglings have not eased the tension. So, uh, Boris Johnson has clearly stated that Russia is risking a new Chechnya if it invades Ukraine. The question is, will Russia go that far and invade Ukraine? Or even if it doesn't, this area will continue to be tense. That's what we're looking at in the coming days, at least in the coming months, because we don't really see a solution of how this tension is going to ease up, because the talks also have not really yielded any result. Now, if we shift our focus and look at what's happening in Oslo right now, the Taliban, after recapturing power in Kabul for the first time, have come out of Afghanistan and are holding a meeting in Norway, in Oslo. And the focus here of this meeting is, of course, the humanitarian crisis and the human right issue. We know this is happening when Afghanistan is in the middle of a huge humanitarian crisis. About 55% probably of the population is on the verge of hunger. We know what's happening to women, to girls. The schools are still shut. The women's rights, of course, we cannot even talk about, because the basic human rights are not met. While these talks are happening with the civil society, Afghan civil society, some of the Afghan civil society members and others living outside Afghanistan are also protesting, saying that this is probably going to legitimize the Taliban, and talking to the Taliban is not okay, because you're actually talking to terrorists. And also remember that this is this delegation also has Anas Haqqani there. And Anas Haqqani, of course, is part of that powerful Haqqani faction, which is a very violent group. So do you think there is this fear that these talks will normalize the Taliban and strengthen them? Is that a possibility? And what were the other options? Because the country is caught in a big humanitarian crisis and something has to be done.
Yes, and I think that's the real issue for international community at the moment, that there is a humanitarian crisis, and the crisis actually is of Taliban's own making. and I think the supporters of Taliban, who have been supporting them for years now. And this is not a crisis that was not anticipated. So clearly, I think the challenge is of the Taliban's own making. But the reality is that international community cannot look the other way if you have this kind of a humanitarian disaster unfolding. So some kind of an engagement becomes something that has to be taken forward. The question is once again on what terms and conditions, these what terms and conditions will lead to the unfolding of these talks, what sort of bargaining will be done at these talks, and what can one make the Taliban relent on some of the issues that they espouse. I mean, if you have observed Taliban for long, you know that it's very unlikely that they would change anything fundamental about themselves, about their ideology. But I think the expectation in these talks is to once again assess whether this can be done. And of course, we know that these talks are happening in Oslo, and Norway has long taken this position of conflict resolution, and as the center of conflict resolution for itself relatively seriously. So one hopes that they'll be able to find some via media where the Taliban. Where the humanitarian assistance can flow into Afghanistan. But I think that concern is genuine, that in the garb of this humanitarian crisis, the Taliban will be pushing for their own legitimization. And we know that they are working very closely with China, for example, in pushing China on giving them legitimacy and recognizing them. In fact, there have been lots of rounds of talks where they are pushing China to do that. It is interesting that China remains very reluctant, despite the initial enthusiasm with which China welcomed them. Russia, in fact, remains very reluctant. And we know that Central Asia remains very reluctant. And of course, Central Asian leaders will be having a virtual summit with Prime Minister Modi this week, where this issue will be front and center, because ultimately, Europeans can give them recognition. The West can can engage with the Taliban, but the costs of that recognition would be borne by the region. So I think it is important that regional states find a solution to this problem. There is a humanitarian crisis. India has tried its own way to help the ordinary Afghans in this crisis, but given our lack of connectivity, contiguity, it's very difficult. We know that Pakistan had been such a big stumbling block, with basic humanitarian aid also being a problem. But I think the world will have to figure out, whether there is a in their attempt to find a short-term solution to a humanitarian crisis, they may just unfold a long-term humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, because I think that is what ultimately should be the aim, to ensure that the Taliban become more inclusive, that the Taliban start governing with some principles of human rights embedded in their organizational structures. Unless that happens, I think these crises will keep on coming, and the world will have to find solutions to these crises one at a time.
All right. Like you said, that it's very unlikely that the Taliban will change in any way, because that has not really happened. Anybody who's been watching the Taliban, in fact, a lot of people who are also protesting right now have said that even though these talks are taking place, there is no hope. It's a distant possibility that Taliban are going to change their ideology. And very quickly, Harsh, you mentioned Pakistan right now, when I was thinking there is a lot of talk and discussion that has happened about the new national security policy coming out in Pakistan at a time. The times are very interesting. This is a time when the Imran Khan government itself is caught up in many problems, and many people are speculating that the government may be actually on its way out. The inflation is at an all-time high, probably is the third highest inflation in the world that Pakistan is facing. Now, this NSP, which has been eulogized internally, I would like you to analyze it on two fronts. First of all, what changes in Pakistan internally? Do you think a lot of people like Aisha Siddiqa have commented that there is a there is a shift in focus from geostrategy to geoeconomics, but then the civil military imbalance is very, very wide, and it doesn't seem to be working. And the other thing that we would like to develop on is, does it signal a rethink on India?
Yeah, this is very interesting. I think it has taken up so much space in recent weeks, uh, but it seems completely disproportionate to what is perhaps the situation within Afghanistan is, because clearly, as you were saying, there are speculations about the Imran Khan government itself, and the opposition is not really enthusiastic about this document. I mean, opposition has not really supported the document. Now, the question is, so what is the shelf life of this document, first of all? Whether it will just go out once the Imran Khan government bows out of office, or there is some sustainability. Now, one has, there are some good ideas in there, but the how do you operationalize those ideas when you have two problems? One, you have the problem that you were identifying earlier, in the sense of civil military divide, which is widening, which has widened in recent times, and that seems, there are no signs that there is any possibility of that being getting any smoother anytime soon. So without that acceptance of most of the stakeholders on board, how do you take a document which is a national security document seriously? Because you need the civilians as well as the military on board when it comes to such a document. The other aspect is, some of the things that are said, it seems that it's like a it's, it, you know it's like a salad bowl of various arguments about geoeconomics, human security. There is this idea of how do you make Pakistan the center of regional connectivity. A lot of these ideas, which I think are mentioned, but what is not made clear is how do you then operationalize these ideas. It is all very well to say, well, we want a global peace and we want regional peace, but how do you then go about doing that has not been made very clear. So it's very unlikely, it seems, that it will be taken seriously anywhere as far as Pakistan's external observers are concerned. Where it is important, I think, from Pakistan's point of view, is that Pakistan is in such a dire strait at the moment that it makes sense for Pakistan to come out with a document of this kind, to showcase to the world that they are learning, that they are improving, that there is a sense within Pakistan that that the challenges that Pakistan faces have become so enormous and have gotten so out of hand that they need external support, and for that external support, uh, they need the outside world to look at Pakistan through a different lens. And I think this document, it seems, is entirely about doing that image management, rather than looking at the domestic situation very, very carefully, because any national security document is basically trying to set a serious national security document tries to set up a balance between ends, ways, and means. But here there is nothing there, because the ends are identified in terms as if Pakistan is really the anchor in this part of the world. It is not. Its economy is smaller than the economy of the city of Mumbai. Now, and as you were mentioning, you have this extraordinary inflation rate, great challenges in the last few years, and there is no possibility that that's going to change anytime soon. So when you don't have the ability to do a lot of the things that you are saying, you are basically providing a document for external stakeholders to look at Pakistan and say, well, maybe Pakistan is improving and maybe there is a room to support them. I think many in India will not take it seriously, as you can imagine, because ultimately, when it comes to India question, the Jammu and Kashmir question is at the heart of it. And also, if Pakistan is so interested in becoming the center of the geo-economic and geo-connect and in connectivity in the region, then the simplest thing it can do is to enhance trade linkages with India. And we know what that means when it comes to Pakistan. It is not going to happen anytime soon, and I don't think there is any appetite within Pakistan to do that. So Jammu and Kashmir issue becomes central to their argument about engagement with India. And
Yes.
India being where it is, I think there is no incentive on the part of India also to move, because what India has done, I think, is very interesting in the last seven years. Before 7 years, there used to be this argument in India that, look, engagement with Pakistan is very, very important for India. what India has done is to show in the last few years that even if India does not engage with Pakistan, it does not really, change India's regional and global standing. India can continue to do lots of things that it can do globally and regionally, even without engaging Pakistan. So I think that's something that's a real challenge for Pakistan. How do you create a mindset in India that, or incentive structure in India to engage with Pakistan, so that Pakistan can really go into those areas that it wants to go into, as exemplified by this NSP. But I don't think there is enough consensus within Pakistan on that itself. So I think we will wait and watch and see whether this national security policy is operationalized at all, and if at all it gets operationalized, which are the stakeholders that are going to support it in Pakistan. At the moment, it looks very unlikely that there are many supporters.
Absolutely. Probably, like you mentioned, it's probably just an exercise in image building for the outside world. It doesn't really have much significance at a time when the government may be on its way out. And like you said, there's hardly any appetite in Pakistan's military establishment, especially to improve ties with India. And India can continue to come together with other important players in the region without really engaging with Pakistan, as has happened in the last few years. So there is also another topic that we wanted to discuss, Harsh, but since I think we're out of time on this episode, we wanted to look at Southeast Asia and the sale of BrahMos supersonic missiles to Philippines. We will probably look at it in the coming episode of the Ideas Factory. Do send in your questions. There are many questions that have come in related to China, but we'll probably take them up in the next episode. So for this episode, that's it from us. Thank you for watching.